What's up, Ego Hackers? Welcome to Season 14, Part 3, Episode 3, the ENTJ and ISFJ sexual relationship lecture. Ultimately, the Bronze Pair lecture, also known as the Natural Pair. It's been really great to have the opportunity to do this particular season. The audience has been asking for it for a very long time. We finally decided to do it and go over all of the unique components to this particular relationship, while also offering maybe some additional insight from a golden pair perspective, because there are a lot of people out there who are questioning whether or not the golden pair is the absolute best decision for them to have a foundation from which to, have a family, etc., or a long-term relationship, or even a marriage. And I would submit to you folks that the bronze pair, also known as the natural pair, be a strong contender or for such a relationship to facilitate a family. And of course, that has extreme value, especially to this particular natural pair, the ENTJ and the ISFJ. My good friend Titus, and even though she's technically not legally his wife, she basically is his wife, and she's an ISFJ woman, and their relationship is just it's kind of a big deal. It's it's everything. It's so interesting. Like, in my close circle of friends, there's far more natural pairs than there actually are golden pairs. Golden pairs are kind of a rare thing when it comes to my closest friends. More people are natural pairs than any other actual relationship, honestly. So, if you just look at the statistics, from a rational point of view, one could actually conclude that the natural pair is probably the absolute one to invest in. And of course, with ENTJs watching this particular lecture, probably the main question that they have to ask is like, okay, Mr. C.S. Joseph, which relationship is actually the absolute best relationship to invest in? Because that's one of the things about ENTJs you have to be aware of. Because they have introverted feeling inferior, they're actually pretty afraid of investing in the wrong thing. And as much as they are afraid of being worthy or not good enough, but given that introverted feeling is the investment function, they're actually really afraid of what to invest in. And they're very outcome focused. They are a control type, and they're always focused on the outcome. And oftentimes, ENTJs don't even want to get into the role of having a sexual relationship, at least a long-term sexual relationship, until they know for sure that it's going to be a good investment. It takes a very, very long time for them to commit. Not only that, they don't have as much pressure to commit because of introverted sensing trickster, which means they're kind of completely unaware of committing, or they end up committing to the wrong things. And that can also serve as an area of self-sabotage for an ENTJ. That could lead to a lot of problems, especially when it comes to their sexual relationships. So when you combine introverted sensing trickster with introverted feeling inferior, this becomes a huge, huge issue, right? But then if you look at it from the ISFJ perspective, there's plenty of fear there. You already have the virtue and vice, faith versus fear, when it comes to the ISFJ, and we've covered virtue and vice in Season 7 playlist on the YouTube channel and on the podcast. But from the ISFJ point of view, they're already afraid of not being wanted, so they need to be with somebody who's super wanty. Let's be honest, ENTJs kind of come off super rapey, and because they're very obvious with how rapey they seem, it kind of makes a lot of sense that an ISFJ would get with them, because there's no doubt in the ISFJ's mind that the ENTJ actually wants them. So, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But it goes on further that oftentimes, though, the ISFJ worries about whether or not they're actually going to be able to perform really well for their ENTJ. But luckily for them, an ENTJ doesn't really care that much about an ISFJ's performance, because their introverted sensing trickster is often a moving target. And because you have this moving target that's going on, especially in the context of a sexual relationship, performance just really isn't that high of a priority to an ENTJ, because the ENTJ is the one who's actually mentally taking upon that role in terms of the relationship itself. They are the performer. They do not necessarily see performance as an area of responsibility for the ISFJ. Unless, of course, the ISFJ unless they have children, then performance may actually be something that really matters to the ENTJ, because the ENTJ would be monitoring the impact that the ISFJ would have on their children. And that goes regardless of biological gender. Like it doesn't matter. That would be the case, and you know how ENTJs are all about performance reviews. And then you have the introverted feeling critic from the ISFJ who's all about submitting to those performance reviews, because the ISFJ is extremely submissive, right? This is one of the reasons why ISFJ men are actually insanely unattractive to women in general, because ISFJ men are just submissive. And one of the problems that we have in today's society is that because women are able to provide their own provisioning and provide for themselves, society takes care of female protection and protection of women. Women don't need protection from men anymore. Society brainwashes women into thinking that society will actually have women's back, when society actually doesn't. They just lie to them, and women eat it up for some reason. And then also parental investment. Parental investment comes super easy, from an ISFJ man. And as a result, ISFJ men end up coming off super mega feminine to women because they are providing these beta traits. And women are just not really that attracted to ISFJ men in general, which causes a problem. But luckily for ISFJ men, the ENTJ exists because the ENTJ woman is actually insanely masculine. ISFJ men, for example, are the most likely out of all of the 16 types in terms of men, most willing to actually become stay-at-home dads, while ENTJ women are most likely out of all of the 16 types for women to be career women, right? So this ends up like somehow working out. They're perfectly, down to take on these roles. I actually know an ISFJ who's very close to me in my life who had to be a stay-at-home dad. He was Mr. Mom, basically. And while it provided him a lot of joy, there was also some internal pain and internal struggle in terms of him not having the opportunity to further develop his masculinity, because masculinity to an ISFJ man is more of a learned behavior instead of a natural behavior. Whereas if he was like an ENTJ man, it would be more of a natural behavior, because like I said, STP and NTJs, at least those archetypes, they have natural masculinity. Whereas, SFJ or NTP men, for example, like Crusader men, they have to actually learn how to be masculine via learned behavior later in life. And that too can also provide a bunch of conflict and reduction of opportunity for men, ultimately, when it comes to having relationships with women. So all of these social issues end up flying out of out of the closet, because they're hidden in the closet for a while. And it ends up just blowing up in everyone's face. Well, that's why the natural pair exists for these two types, because the natural pair actually ends up basically cleaning up and protecting from these anxieties. And it's great. It's really great for both of these people to have the natural pair. Because then, for example, the ENTJ doesn't walk around feeling like their rationale is being entirely challenged by the TI child of the ISFJ. And the ISFJ is walking around not believing like they're constantly uncomfortable from the perspective of the ENTJ. The ISFJ gets to enjoy always being wanted, always being comfortable, always being listened to, and actually ask questions, which proves to the ISFJ that they're actually valued, which is fantastic. And then also, obviously, the ENTJ ends up having a bunch of freedom. They have an opportunity to get reactions from someone else when they perform well, and they see this person react good to them, which reminds them that they're doing a good job, that they are actually worthy. And the ISFJ is just there to consistently paint a picture of, hey, ENTJ, my ENTJ love, you are absolutely worthy in my eyes. You always have been, you always will be, as that extrovert intuition inferior aspires their ENTP subconscious to further build a better future for them together. And don't forget, the ISFJ is super affiliative. They don't want to do things alone, which further embeds their already egregiously high amount of loyalty to the ENTJ. That way the ENTJ never actually has to concern themselves with fears or worries when it comes to abandonment. They never really actually, abandonment just becomes this afterthought, basically, within the context of this relationship. So it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't actually happen. And then, because of that, it's never a worry or a concern or, something that that ends up becoming a priority because the ISFJ just isn't going to do that. And then the ENTJ realizes like, okay, wow, this is an insanely loyal person. And then it allows the ENTJ to relax and just focus on what actually matters, what matters to them, their own personal freedom, their freedom of choice. But then they get to use their freedom of choice in such a way for the benefit of the ISFJ. And then, the ENTJ realizes the ISFJ is slowly over time becoming more and more dependent upon the ENTJ, which allows the ENTJ to feel comfortable because they're comfortable. The ISFJ is comfortable being dependent upon the ENTJ, and then the ENTJ is like, okay, great, these people are going to stick around, and I get to be in full control, and I don't have to really worry about anything. But at the same time, the ENTJ realizes that the ISFJ is smart enough and growing smarter over time and becoming more and more intellectual as they grow over time, especially as they develop their ENTP subconscious, that, yeah, sure, even the ISFJ does have options and could potentially, leave at some point in time as their quality increases. But then they're also realizing that the ISFJ just doesn't want to. The ISFJ highly enjoys extroverted sensing child, highly enjoys introvert intuition parent, highly enjoys being listened to by extroverted thinking hero, as well as extroverted thinking hero guiding the ISFJ's thinking, because the ISFJ is constantly gaslighting themselves over whether or not they're a good person, whether or not they're worthy, whether or not they're worth investing in which the ENTJ is happy to correct them on. And they're both systematic, and they both live their life by some form of procedure and system. And it really helps the ENTJ, again, feel comfortable in terms of control, but it also gives the ISFJ the opportunity to not only develop and design new systems that could be executed by the ENTJ, but they end up have a shared participation with the systems that they create for their life that would guarantee each other mutual success. And that is basically, the entire point of the relationship. It's a relationship of execution. It's kind of like when you think from an information technology standpoint, like DevOps, or when you think of an assembly line. There's nothing more assembly line like than the natural pair according to the ENTJ and ISFJ. Their entire relationship is just one giant assembly line. Like, they have a problem, they have an issue. They do a little bit of research and development. They do some R&D on it. They develop a system or a procedure to follow, and then they execute that system and procedure, and then they look at the results of what happened, which creates feedback, creates a feedback loop, go back to the drawing board if the problem wasn't solved, and they just keep doing that over and over and over and over and over until the problem is solved, and eventually it will be solved. This is a relationship that is actually centered around goals and problem solving. And as a result of this, it creates this amazing engine of execution for both the types. To the point where, I have noticed, in my life, in terms of, you could say, wealth generation or monetary success, ISFJ with ENTJ pairs, in my opinion, this is more of an opinion, not necessarily a fact, but in my opinion, based on anecdotal evidence in my life, these are what I would call the power couples. These are the relationships that have the most wealth compared to other relationships and other compatibilities. Straight up, hands down, this is it. This is absolutely it, folks. And oftentimes people just don't even realize, some of the results, the really good results, the really good fruit that can come from these different kinds of relationships. But, ENTJs are all about getting rich. They could get pretty greedy, but then all of a sudden they become insanely altruistic. And one of the reasons that's even able to happen is because of the ISFJs in their life. And then ISFJs are constantly trying to become satisfied throughout their life on a regular basis because they're very envious people. But guess what? Because the ENTJ is pretty greedy, bringing so much into their family, into their lives, the ISFJ is actually able to experience satisfaction through their relationship with the ENTJ. This is just typical heart temple plus body temple relationship, and it absolutely is key to the long-term strategic success of this relationship. These types don't even get into a relationship because they're both outcome focused. They don't even get into a relationship unless the outcome is already discussed, and that outcome is almost always a form of success. You see what I'm saying, folks? Success is the entire point of the relationship. And these two are not going to get into the relationship unless that is entirely understood. Even if the ISFJ is the man in the relationship and not the woman of the relationship, as colloquially would be expected within Western culture. But But yeah, it's just incredible just to see the synergy between these two types. And oftentimes, I will admit that I personally actually look up to these kinds of relationships, like Titus and Rochelle, for example. I definitely look up to them and their relationship and everything that they have going on. Sure, sometimes we may have disagreements, or I may disagree about how they handle certain things. But the thing is that at the end of the day, I can't ignore or argue the results. The results are good every single time. Like, it just is what it is. Sure, everyone has their daily struggles and whatnot, but they're always going to be able to get through it. They're always going to be able to take their relationship to the next level, and just eventually, like, it'll skyrocket. It'll skyrocket into something that is entirely special. They end up as a result, time goes on, and the level of investment is there. You have FI critic investing, you have FI inferior investing, and the relationship is just entirely centered around the goal or the focus of blessing. Blessing being, as defined by both of these types, are getting way more out of the relationship than what they are putting in. It is a recipe for success, literally. I would actually argue that when compared to the INTP plus ENTJ golden pair, or the ISFJ plus ESFP golden pair, that those two relationships do not experience as much success, and I mean like material success, for example, wealth success, even social success in life, more so than their natural pair, more so than the ENTJ and the ISFJ. If success really is that important to you, then I would submit to you that this particular relationship should be heavily considered, if not put to the forefront for these types, especially in Western society. Given Western society is primarily capitalist and whatnot, if you really want to have a great investment for your family and your future, I think this natural pair definitely dwarfs the golden pairs that are available to these types tenfold, very easily. That's not necessarily what I would say about other types and other pairs, though. I probably wouldn't say that about other ones. Like maybe, for example, the ESTP and the INFP. There's something to be said about potentially more success from an ESTP ISTJ relationship or an INFJ ENFJ relationship in certain cases. But for this particular natural pair, just with how things work from a neutral perspective, I really think they have an extremely high value, very, very high value from that perspective. So, but yeah, let's actually talk about some of the details here. So, how is it that an ENTJ and an INTJ are ultimately drawn together? I mean, we already talked about how it's all about goals and execution, and they're both trying to have an outcome for success. We already talked about that. But honestly, the ENTJ and the ISFJ for each other literally is the total package. I mean, sure, you can make that argument they're golden pairs as well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their golden pairs are really guaranteed to deliver their cognitive origins to each other on a silver platter. Whereas based on my life experience, I really, really maintain that the ENTJ ISFJ relationship it is basically guaranteed to give the ISFJ satisfaction and guaranteed to give purpose to the ENTJ within their lives. That which what they are seeking from their lives the most, I really see it that way. I strongly believe that. And most people, they kind of balk at me like that when it comes to the golden pairs. But, golden pairs, they're the highest highs, the highest lows. Oftentimes, golden pairs have to suffer a breakup before and then get back together before they actually realize they want to stay with each other. There could be a lot of issues there. But when it comes down to just the straight up power couple dynamic, the power couple dynamic is really expressed here in ENTJ and ISFJ better than anywhere else. With the exception of maybe ENTP, INTJ golden pair, maybe ENTP, ISFP. Another example of power couple is ISTP, ENFP. That is a huge power couple as well, but that's the last episode of the series, so we'll talk about that. But there's just a couple of different couplings that, neutrally speaking, from a Western society perspective, really are the power couple, and this is one of them, the ISFJ, ENTJ for sure. So just remember, the natural pair, it's very easy, it's very exciting, it's got a bond that's just not easily broken. It also is, what's great about it is that, like, it's the one relationship where you could just be yourself, and a lot of times, when men ask other men for advice about, like, how to be around women, oftentimes they're told, hey, just be yourself, or, well, that does not apply to, like, any of the other relationships except the natural pair. Literally, it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply at all. Only to the natural pair does it apply that you can, quote, be yourself. Like me being an ENTP and me being like a totally creepy dude. Like, let's be honest, I'm creepy AF. Like, I've always been labeled that way. I've always been treated that way my entire life. It's extroverted sensing demon. It just comes with the territory of being an ENTP. But I can go up to an ISFP woman and be creepy AF, and they actually find it cute. See what I'm saying? Like I actually can be myself, and they actually can be themselves too. Like, if they want to indulge in their ENTJ subconscious's rapiness with me, they can, and I would find it cute and endearing, which is fascinating if you think about it. They can just indulge themselves. And the natural pair is basically like the relationship of indulgence. They can indulge their egos, and no one's going to get offended, and actually the other person is just going to be attracted by the other person indulging in their ego, which is awesome. Most people don't even have the opportunity of being able to indulge in their egos when it comes to relationships. Oftentimes, people are just subjected to harsh judgments. I mean, my relationship with Ray, for example, I am subjected to harsh judgments on a regular basis, and I would imagine she is as well from me. We TI parent the fuck out of each other, and as a result of that, it ends up becoming very dicey at times, because there's constantly this caricature of judgment or misjudgment that we place on one another all the time. But, like, if I'm like with like an ISFP girl, or if I'm with like an INTJ girl, I don't even have that problem, and it's especially true among ISFPs. I could be as edgelord as I want and nothing's going to happen, and as much as an ENTJ, within the context of this natural pair, they can be as greedy or as, not caring about how other people feel, treating people like machines, or enslaving as they want. As much as they want, they just subjugate people and bend them to their will. And that would actually just bring joy and attraction by the part of the ISFJ. It just does. And the ISFJ gets off on it. It's hilarious. Or when the ISFJ is this loyal knight in shining armor, and the ENTJ looks at the chivalrous knight in shining armor and is like, oh man, I wish I was a little bit more like that. And they totally get off on that too, because they just love that tradition. They love it when the door is held open for them, for example, or when they're offered help, because guess what? The ISFJ is like the helper type. They're all about offering help on a consistent basis, So again, it's all about indulging each other's egos. It's an amazing combination of stability and fun. So just remember, folks, the theme of the natural pair is basically easy. It's an extremely easy relationship. It is the easiest relationship out of all the 8 sexual compatibilities. The difference is, though, is that it's a little bit more difficult of a relationship to get in when compared to a golden pair. Golden pair is a lot easier to get in, but it's actually a lot harder to maintain. Whereas the natural pair is a lot harder to get into, but it's a lot easier to maintain, basically. So there's some trade-offs there. So it's not intrinsically volatile like the golden pair, which is the affection relationship, or inherently challenging like the pedagogue, which is the companion relationship. It's natural because you can be at ease with who you are while in the relationship. And, just golden pairs, like, they expect compatibility. They expect origin. They have the expectations of, a person having already arrived at a certain standard, at a certain level of success in their life before the relationship can even begin, oftentimes. And, and that's not you could argue that that's kind of shallow, but it's really not, because the golden pair, while it is an easier relationship to get into, maintaining it is hard, because oftentimes people at the beginning of the relationship are just trying to make a really good first impression. And golden pairs, it's easy to make that really good first impression, but after they get to know each other, when the honeymoon period is over, for example, the infatuation period is over, it's difficult. It's really difficult to maintain the relationship, or at least it becomes really difficult to maintain the relationship, because it's like, hey, all the good and first impressions are gone. You weren't exactly what I thought you were, which ends up leading to a breakup. And then after that, the golden pair is like, okay, we're broken up. But then they realize, oh yeah, like the grass isn't greener anywhere else, and they end up going back to their golden pair afterwards, and then they end up reconciling, and they stay together forever. Basically, that's generally how the golden pair works. But luckily, you don't have that issue within the natural pair. It's just really hard to get into the natural pair to begin with. So that's another issue. Just kind of be aware of that dynamic. As a result. So, but let's talk about the gender differences between the ENTJ and the ISFJ in terms of what are the biological gender differences between both types and how they affect this relationship, which is very important. So, masculine idealism in terms of like an ISFJ, this makes the man very super self-sacrificing. He will go all in on effort, maximum effort, Deadpool style. And it is a relationship about sacrifice while simultaneously having the expectation that his ENTJ woman will appreciate, if not worship, the amount of effort and investment that he puts into the relationship, which is completely counter to what people like Rollo Tomasi actually teach. Because from Tomasi's point of view, no woman, especially in Western society, appreciates a man's relationship equity or their relationship investment. Whereas out of all the 16 types, ISFJ men put in the most value. They place the most value on their relationship investment and their relationship equity, etc. They have a concept of relationship equity. But oftentimes it's really hard for them to swallow, hard pill for them to swallow when they realize that female solipsism just doesn't care about their relationship equity. And, having an ENTJ woman is the most likely to appreciate that relationship equity because they themselves see everything from the perspective of equity, from the perspective of investment. And they see that their ISFJ man is putting in an insane amount of investment. So oftentimes they feel bad about themselves for not investing as much because of how greedy they are. So as a result of that, the ENTJ woman ends up rising to the occasion because her man is leading in that area. This is probably one of the few relationships that actually can break that red pill Tomasi mold in that regard. Now, would that be the case for a golden pair for either of these? No. It absolutely would not. It would absolutely not be the case. But that it would be the case for a natural pair, at least this natural pair. And then also masculine idealism in terms of the ENTJ, all about, execution, all about performing on a regular basis. But it's mostly about like their level of investment, as well as how much knowledge that they gain, and being very idealistic about all the knowledge that they need to have in order to be successful, about making themselves as worthy as much as they can. And then taking that ideal, it's just like, they have this thing about them where they don't want their ISFJ women to like fall behind. So they'll just pick up that ISFJ and just drag them along with them, basically, because they don't want their ISFJ woman to fall into an area of decay, right? And, because of that, like their idealism ends up creating the situation where it's like, hey, I'm investing a lot in you. I see that you're investing back in me, and that's fantastic. But at the same time, I need to make sure that you're being just as skilled. I need to make sure that you are putting your effort into the right place, basically. And then showing sympathy and appreciation for when his woman actually puts that in the right place, that's important. And this can cause the ENTJ man to be actually really, really forgiving to a point, especially when the ISFJ would maybe do something wrong or fail eventually. And it's because the ENTJ male would end up respecting proving appreciation of her maximum effort because of that level of investment, because of that level of loyalty, right? Because the ENTJ knows that the ISFJ has a pattern of behavior when it comes to loyalty, and then he would be more willing to allow things to slide over time. That's just one example. But ISFJ women, they could be pretty solipsistic, and then sometimes they can oftentimes be entitled to looking good in front of other people, and this can be a problem for their ENTJ men. And oftentimes they can become entitled to what the ENTJ man's treasure, basically, because the ENTJ men are wayfarers, and oftentimes watching ISFJ women being entitled to, the new levels that her man has brought in her life, because like he's constantly They never used to eat at Anthony's before. Or she's never been to Ruth's Chris before. Or she's never been to Morton's before. And then all of a sudden, like, she has that expectation from her ENTJ lover to always bring her to those places. And then she doesn't feel special anymore when she doesn't. And that's an aspect of solipsism actually happening within the context of this relationship. And that's also kind of how idealism can get in the way of the ENTJ, because then ENTJ is like, wow, maybe I shouldn't have doted upon my ISFJ woman so much, right? What happens when the situation is reversed? When the ENTJ woman becomes very solipsistic, well, the problem is that she often doesn't even remember her own failure, and then she ends up being entitled to being a failure within the relationship. And then the ISFJ is so tolerant of literally everything. The ISFJ man in the relationship ends up becoming overly tolerant to the failures of the ENTJ woman. And that's one way that the ISFJ ends up enabling the ENTJ woman. This could be a huge problem. And, like I said previously in previous lectures, the natural pair is the relationship where there's an extremely high risk of these types enabling each other. And that's just one of the ways it happens, right? The ENTJ man enabling the ISFJ woman, wanting to always do these, very high, classy, highbrow things all the time. And then the ISFJ man just enabling and tolerating failure on the part and the greed on the part of the ENTJ woman, because the ISFJ man is pre-built to take more hits than any of the other 16 types. And it's like the ENTJ woman can just take anything from the ISFJ man, and he's not really going to do anything about it. It's one of the reasons why the song React by Pussycat Dolls actually exists. Just listen to the lyrics, although it's an INTJ woman talking about like stories from her past, because it's SE inferior just trying to get her man to react. And it seems like, she's with some crusader dude who's just simping after her, and she ends up hating and resenting him after a while, right? Well, that can happen in any relationship, regardless of natural pairs. There's the lowest chance of it happening in a natural pair, but it's still like, it could be, a problem, So, and again, the ENTJ woman's greed ends up becoming super enabled by the ISFJ man in that regard. And then, and then when that happens, the ISFJ man loses all motivation to actually be putting an effort, and then it ends up becoming a race to a bottom instead of the race to the top, even though this relationship has the highest chance of becoming the race to the top, literally. So in as much as they can be a race to the top, they can also be a race to the bottom. And like I said, in previous lectures, like the natural pair, like if you see couples on the side of the street and they're homeless, they're likely to be a natural pair. I mean, that's how enabling these people are. That's how oblivious they can be to like their enabling and codependent behaviors. And that's what masculine idealism does to ISFJ men. It makes them codependent. And, that's what masculine idealism does to ENTJ men. It makes them way too generous to the point where they can be taken advantage of. That's a problem. And then like the solipsism of ENTJ women, they can end up seriously just take without giving very much in the relationship. And then the ISFJ's expectations, an ISFJ woman's expectations as a result of female solipsism can cause her to have unrealistic expectations, especially when, like, for example, if money is, like let's say a business deal went south for her ENTJ man, and then, all of a sudden she can't go to Anthony's on her birthday anymore. And then her FI critic's going to feel less special about herself. SI heroes be like, well, I was expecting something better. And then she ends up having problems with the ENTJ. And then there's this silent resentment, there's silent bitterness that's building up within the ISFJ woman, when she should actually just realize that, everything that she was given before is a gift. And, she can't always expect with her NI demon that she's always going to be given the same level or a greater level of something amazing in her life. And that's how these relationships can end up working. But the worst part is that the natural pair, they end up enabling these behaviors in one another, which is super frustrating. It happens all the time. It's entirely ridiculous. Every natural pair does it, And this relationship is very similar to like me and an ISFP, because I'm at risk of doing the same thing, in as much as they're at risk of doing the same thing. So it's always something you have to keep an eye on when it comes to natural pairs, always. And again, this is caused by, cognitive looping. Cognitive looping makes men more idealistic and makes women more solipsistic. And so how do they end up viewing each other? Just remember, folks, women view men like a business. The ISFJ or ENTJ man must carry his burden of performance, harder for ISFJ men to do, especially when they're comfortable. And then men view women as art. The ISFJ or ENTJ woman must carry her burden of submission and preservation of beauty, which is harder for ENTJ women to do. But at the end of the day, like, they still have these responsibilities. And as much as these two types have responsibilities to not enable each other, which is the greatest risk and problem when it comes to natural pairs. That's a huge issue. So let's talk about temple influence and origins, okay? And this really matters, because it's important that when we look at these kinds of relationships, we talk about, like, what exactly are these people getting out of these relationships, okay? So what is an ISFJ looking for more out of anything in life? And that is ultimately satisfaction. That is their cognitive origin. Same thing with an ENTJ. Their cognitive origin is purpose. They are looking for purpose. Purpose is everything, because when they have that purpose, they are able to ultimately build a legacy. And as much as when an ISFJ is satisfied, they're satisfied as a result of seeking out their passions and having the freedom to do so and the room to do so without fear of judgment, for example. So that's entirely important. And here's the thing, though. These types also have secondary origins. So, for example, ISFJs, their secondary origin is one of reverence, right? And they have a hard time meeting that reverence or getting that reverence. Reverence is deep respect. And, like, for example, my ISFJ mother-in-law, so I have an INTJ son. Before he was born, we had a baby shower. And my ISFJ mother-in-law thought it was a really good idea to just basically inform Renai that, it was basically her baby shower, and she made it about her, and it was about her reverence and her deep respect, because, she's the baby of the family. This is the first time one of her children was having a child. She's first-time grandmother, etc., and she made it very clear to both of us that it was her show, and I remember, 15 minutes before the baby shower was going to start, this is during COVID, and when that went down, 15 minutes before the baby shower was there, the camera, the sound, none of it was actually set up, and I was still in my office working, and she's freaked out. She started yelling at me and whatnot, and I'm like, don't worry about it, I got it. Well, I got all the gear together, and she's still literally yelling at me, oh, you're making me look bad, you're doing this, you're doing that, and I just ignored her, and I set up all the cameras and everything, and then I hit the play button, and everything was in Zoom, and then literally to the minute when it was starting, when the entire event was starting, to the exact minute, probably within 5 or 10 seconds of the actual time on the atomic clock or global positioning time, all of a sudden, boom, she's live and it's good. And I watched her go from yelling at me because of how I was looking at her bad, because I was harming her reverence as her secondary cognitive origin, to, hey, everybody. And I'm just like, oh my God, really? Wow, you are so disrespectful. That's unbelievable. Maybe you should use your FI critic and actually show your son-in-law some fucking gratitude. That would be nice, instead of just shitting all over him, when he's actually helping you and hosting you at his home. Okay, you disrespect a man like that underneath his roof. Are you serious? You are ridiculous. And I remember just taking her husband, and we actually went to the bar and enjoyed ourselves some nice IPAs without her and without them, because we were just like, fuck this. We're not going to have anything to do with this bullshit. So we left, basically. Her ESFP husband's totally cool, by the way. I love that man. He's a great dude. Totally fun dude. So yeah, I mean, we had a lot of fun. It was really enjoyable. It was fantastic. Him and I in that situation. And it took a long time for her to actually apologize and take responsibility for it, because her need for reverence is still there. It may not be her primary origin of satisfaction, but it's her secondary origin. But let's say she was in a relationship with an ENTJ. What would that look like? Because how does the ENTJ actually help her provide, or help her get reverence? Well, the ENTJ is all about purpose. They're seeking purpose. And as they gain purpose in their life, they actually share that purpose with their ISFJ, to the point where the ISFJ realizes that their reverence, them getting deep respect for others and having deep respect for themselves, is actually sourced from their ENTJ's sense of purpose. And then when they have that shared sense of purpose, that renewed sense of purpose in their life, they realize that all of a sudden people actually start treating them with a high level of deep respect because they see the ISFJ acting out in that ENTJ's purpose, right? And all of a sudden it just works. It works perfectly, right? It works perfectly. And they end up becoming like, OMG, this is like the greatest thing in the world, and yeah. So that's how they're able to get their reverence, is actually through the purpose seeking of the ENTJ. Well, let's look at the reverse. The ENTJ is looking for purpose, but their secondary thing is discovery and exploration. When the ISFJ is trying to satisfy themselves, oftentimes the ISFJ has to actually go exploring to see what else they can find out there in the world to actually satisfy themselves with something, right? From that point of view, it's just like, okay, yeah, we have purpose here. Yeah, we have an opportunity, for me to explore new things because I'm trying to satisfy myself. And then the ENTJ realizes as the ISFJ seeks satisfaction, they actually get to go on a shared journey of exploration and discover new things. And that also further ingratiates these two in terms of the relationship. So actually the natural pair is able to facilitate the missing cognitive origins, because oftentimes the cognitive origins in one's ego, people learn how to get those things for themselves, but they really, really struggle in getting their secondary origins. They really do. And oftentimes look to get their secondary origins from their relationships or from their lovers within their life, right? That's a very common thing. So as a result, this is how cognitive origins actually end up coming out in the context of this relationship. And it's super, super important. So basically, like, how are their basic origins being met? Primarily through the optimistic loops of extroverted thinking to introverted thinking, introverted sensing to extroverted sensing, and secondarily the pessimistic extroverted feeling to introverted feeling, introverted intuition to extroverted intuition. Because remember, like, from a cognitive synchronicity perspective, the functions are consuming each other. The extroverted intuition inferior is being sought after by the introverted intuition parent, and the introverted feeling inferior is being sought after the extroverted feeling parent. So that's the parent-inferior relationship. Then extroverted thinking hero is looking to TI child, and TI child loves it. And then the extroverted sensing child is looking to the introverted sensing hero, and introverted sensing hero loves it. See what I'm saying? So as a result of, that perspective, they end up cognitive looping from an optimistic perspective and cognitive looping from a pessimistic perspective. And it creates an engine that helps facilitate both these types, not only getting their secondary cognitive origin, but also their primary cognitive origins. They literally are a team, and this is kind of just how natural pairs actually work. Because the natural pair, they don't want to see the other person fail. They don't want to see the other person not get their origin. This is one of the ways in which the natural pair takes responsibility for the success of the other person, because the natural pair understands that a person is only going to feel like they have success if that person gets their cognitive origins in life. And the natural pair just naturally is there to serve up cognitive origins on a silver platter. You'd like to think that would be the same in terms of the golden pair. The problem is that the golden pair, they both want the same thing so badly and so desperately that they can actually lead to a small amount of competition for those cognitive origins. And that's one of the reasons why that relationship has the highest highs compared to the lowest lows. And that too can be an issue, right? So the parent's importance and the temple's influence runs a similar course. A responsible parent ensures that the other's inferior grows up. In their subconscious, each type has access to each other's home temple. For example, the ENTJ subconscious the ENTP subconscious accesses the body temple, and the ISFP subconscious accesses the heart temple. Ultimately, each type's other inner temple origin, discovery for the ENTJ and reverence to the ISFJ, can still be met when both these types grow their subconscious, right? And that's super significant. That's super significant. However, because of the constant cognitive looping and the constant delivering of each other's cognitive origins on a silver platter, that is ultimately what creates enabling behavior and enablement, to the point where they can actually enable each other to the ground, which can be a problem. And as much as they can enable each other to the highest heights of success in life, they can enable each other into homelessness, for example, or enable each other into poor health, or even enable each other to death, basically, which is a huge, huge issue, you know. But, you know, and that's super important. But like, and you know, this risk of enablement, you know, it's tested multiple times. It's tested multiple times throughout the life of the relationship, especially like when they get together, like when they start the relationship. You know, that too ends up becoming an issue over time. You know, like, and I've talked about this in past lectures for season 14, part 3, and that is the concept of like the test of the critic versus the test of the parent, right? So for the ENTJ and the ISFJ, you know, like, because, you know, natural pairs tend to last the longest, and they're also the most difficult to get into. Basically, like, there's that one main barrier of entry to get into this relationship for the ISFJ and the ENTJ. And then, you know, let's say they actually get past that barrier of entry. In order to maintain the relationship, they have another barrier of entry. And that's the test of the critic versus the test of the parent. You know, so what does that look like? You know, it's the test of the critic. It's more of like, you know, hey, are you actually already successful in your life? See, that's the thing about the golden pair. The golden pair is a little bit more lax on the inferior functions development in the other person. It's way more lax, but ends up having much higher expectations for that development later. Whereas the test of the critic, you know, in terms of assessing another person's personal growth of their inferior function and how aspirational somebody is with their inferior function, it's based on whether or not that person has that development or is actually going on their way or going all the way with it. There already has to be an aspect of aspirational development within the inferior function to begin with the natural pair. And that's why it's a higher barrier of entry. Here's why. So looking at the ENTJ, they have extrovert intuition critic. And the extrovert intuition critic, it's already like this naturally paranoid thing. It's aware of consequences and bad things that could happen. And it also is aware of what makes people desirable and things that are actually desirable to a point. The problem is that if they see an ISFJ who is not really aware of consequences, not capable of playing it safe or being cautious when necessary, and not handling that point of view, it ends up becoming a serious problem. They're not going to have anything to do with the INTJ. They're not going to even desire that ISFJ, because that ISFJ's extrovert intuition inferior is just insanely underdeveloped. It's like, you're not aware of consequences. How can I be more aware of consequences, especially when I live in the moment, especially with how forgetful I am, and you're not? You're out of your mind. I don't want to be in a relationship with you. I don't desire you. So they end up not opting out for not having a relationship. However, if there is an ISFJ who has invested a lot of time and effort, you know, into making themselves more desirable, aspiring with extrovert intuition inferior, being aware of negative consequences, knowing when to be cautious and knowing when to be risky over time, the ENTJ would be way more attracted to that person. And then as a result, the ENTJ would just make the decision, okay, yeah, I want you. And that's that. And then that decision is made, and they're basically committed to that decision once they have made that decision, right? And the ISFJ is like, oh yeah, I feel wanted finally. Yay, you know, this is fantastic, right? So that's how the test of the critic within the ENTJ is passed. But let's look at the ISFJ. What is the test of the critic there? The ISFJ is already so critical towards their own self-worth, critical towards the value of their own investment. Like literally, ISFJs walk around believing that their investment into other people is either hyper important or not even important at all. And so they place a very critical aspect of importance over the investment that they put into others, right? This is what causes ISFJs to ultimately be covert contracted with people, because people don't respect their level of investment, because the ISFJ is like, hey, I invested in you, so you better have my back. You better want me, etc. You know, that kind of thing, because I actually bothered to put in the effort to invest in you. And the thing is that if they look at an ENTJ and see that the ENTJ is not willing to invest, you know, is not actually willing to actually feel good about themselves and actually treat themselves as if they are a worthy human being, The ISFJ is going to be like, yeah, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with you, because if I treat myself better than you treat yourself, that's saying something. That's telling me that you're probably simping towards me. You're probably thinking, of me as more important than you at that point, and especially after or you're probably thinking of me as more important than you, and that's ridiculous. I need you to be considering yourself more important than me, because this is an area of struggle in my life, and I can't raise another child. I can't raise you and raise myself at the same time. I need this handled. It's too stressful for me to deal with my own critic. So, if the ENTJ passes that test, where the ENTJ values himself properly, understands their investment properly, feel worthy properly, and are actually engaged in, developing and understanding their moral principles throughout life and being a generous person. Think about it. When an ISFJ is generous to somebody and they meet an ENTJ who's not generous at all, do you think the ISFJ is going to be remotely comfortable, much less attracted to the ENTJ? It's not going to happen. They need to see that the ENTJ is far more altruistic and far more generous than they themselves are. That is how the ENTJ passes the test of the critic for the ISFJ. And that's how this relationship can actually exist. Literally. That's how the relationship is even capable of existing. So that's that's a really big deal. A very, very big deal for these types. And that's ultimately what the test of the critic looks like. So the critic's test is as follows. Their inferior function must be as or more developed than my critic. Basically, the ENTJ looks at an underdeveloped ISFJ and thinks, wait, your any inferior is more paralyzed by potential bad outcomes than my expert intuition critic? Why does my expert intuition critic give more choices than your expert intuition inferior? That's ridiculous. The ENTJ needs to see a willingness and an ability for the ISFJ to try new things and demonstrate the skill in providing choices, avoiding bad consequences, and understanding the motivation of others. Ultimately, the ENTJ doesn't want the ISFJ's fear to prevent them from living life, which, again, that's in a nutshell what the test of the critic looks like from the ENTJ to the ISFJ. And going over the notes for the ISFJ side, just to make sure we didn't miss anything, the ISFJ looks at an underdeveloped ENTJ and thinks, wait, you don't show as much appreciation, even as my FI critic does. You have even less sense of worthiness and value than my FI critic does. You want to express yourself even less than my FI critic does. The ISFJ doesn't want to be the main source of feedback, appreciation, and gratitude in the relationship. And they don't want to always have to communicate their own feelings and values. They would rather respond and help shape the ENTJ's feelings and values. Ain't it the truth? If the ENTJ doesn't respect the ISFJ's NE inferior and the ISFJ doesn't respect the ENTJ's FI inferior, this relationship is unlikely to get off the ground. Why? Because without that respect, the basic principle for this relationship is violated. Quote, they would be successful in life even if they never met me. And that's ultimately what the test of the critic is. It's about determining whether or not this person is actually going to be successful with or without me, because the natural pair does not want to be the other person's keeper. They do not want to be someone who is a parent to the other person. Whereas there's other relationships where that ends up actually happening, like the intrigue relationship, that happens a lot. The kindred relationship, especially using those two parent functions that are the same, happens a lot. This happens to Railgun and I almost on a daily basis, where we're having to parent each other, which is really frustrating. But the natural pair, that isn't even allowed to exist. It can't exist. They just can't deal with it. And in some cases, the golden pair actually has this problem, because you still have both parent functions. They're different, for example, me and an INTJ, TI parent versus TE parent, but they're still parental. They still have that parental role. And parenting other parents get really offended when they see another parent giving them parenting advice. You see what I'm saying? Whereas in the natural pair, you have the parent function talking to the baby. You have the hero talking to the child. The child and the baby, the inferior function, they're not going to get offended by what the hero and the parent is going to say, because they already know their place. Whereas in a golden pair, that's not necessarily obvious, right? And that contributes to the failure of the golden pair relationship. It can be such a serious issue. Now, while the test of the critic can seem very challenging, it is easier to maintain the relationship, but you still have to put in the effort to maintain a natural pair. And maintaining a natural pair is based on whether or not the couple is willing to take responsibility for the other person's success, which is hard, because if you think about it, that almost sounds like a complete contradiction to what I just said a minute ago, when it comes to having the whole thing of okay, yeah, this person will be successful regardless of me being in a relationship with them. But here's the thing. we're still human. And if in a relationship we're not willing, especially in a natural pair, if in a relationship with a natural pair we're not willing to take responsibility for the other person's success, yes, we ourselves will be successful regardless of the other person. But remember, new levels bring new devils, and some people grow at different rates. And because people grow at different rates, it is actually possible within the context of a natural pair to leave the other person behind. And then that ends up creating unfair judgment. Because when you leave someone behind and then you judge them for being behind, but you're the one who actually left them behind, you're the one that actually potentially destroyed the relationship if you think about it. That's why it's important that eventually both people within the relationship, especially after the honeymoon phase is over and the relationship becomes less about wants and more about needs, the couple ends up realizing that they have to take responsibility for the other person's success. Because it ends up becoming like this fair complementary trade. I'm not trying to say this relationship becomes transactional. I'm trying to say this is an area where they can actually end up helping each other. Because it actually helps them develop their own sense of responsibility and their own parent functions, because their parent functions are able to guarantee that the other person's inferior remains aspirational and keeps growing, which then keeps the relationship going, right? They keep up the growth to keep up the goeth, or the goeth, the going, basically. The growing for going within the relationship, which keeps the cognitive origins being served up on a silver platter, basically. I mean, why would you expect anything less? So this ends up introducing the concept known as the test of the parent, which we've talked about oftentimes. So if the ENTJ and the ISFJ both pass the test of the critic and the relationship gets off the ground, then the test of the parent ultimately begins. Why does the parent have a test? The parent wants to see if the other person's inferior is capable of humility as a result of aspiration. Because remember, if your inferior function becomes aspirational, it starts acting like a hero function. And the hero function is all about pride. It can rest on its laurels. It has to have humility as a result of the success. It has to. The parent doesn't demand complete integration of the subconscious, but it does demand the potential for development and personal growth ultimately. The parent intuitively understands that if there is no humility in the other person's inferior, the relationship will ultimately stagnate. And here's the thing. Parent functions can turn off because they just get tired of having to deal with the child function and the inferior function all day, which leads to enabling. Because if their parent function turns off, chances are the other person's parent function is going to turn off, and then they end up enabling each other into the ground instead of enabling each other for success. Which enabling each other for success really comes from just them both having enough sense to hold each other accountable and take responsibility for the other person's personal growth by holding each other accountable as a result. This is what happens between the parent function to the inferior relationship. It's where the critic stops. Because the test of the critic is about the critic function taking responsibility for the inferior function, but the test of the parent is when it shifts to the role of the parent taking responsibility for the inferior function. So, what does this actually look like? Well, let's say so the NI parent basically, ends up showing to, the NE inferior. And sometimes the NE inferior can get really scared about bad consequences, but the NI parent can see their way through those bad consequences and chart a course and get past and get through those landmines. For example, they're standing in the field of landmines. The ISFJ would be too scared to cross it, but the ENTJ would be able to plot a course through those landmines and get them safely to the other side, right? That's an example of NI parent, leading the extrovert intuition inferior. And if the ENTJ is being responsible, the ENTJ would be able and capable enough to actually be able to plot that course and execute that plan to get them through that field of landmines, basically, safely to the side without dying or losing one of their limbs in the process. Well, same thing applies on the other side. For example, sometimes the ENTJ has a crisis of identity, a crisis of morals, a crisis of principles, where they just wow, midlife crisis hits, am I actually good enough to actually do that? It's kind of one of the reasons why Ray Dalio, who is an ENTJ, he wrote the book Principles, where he's talking about the value of principles. And the ENTJ ends up having a lot of fear and doubt over whether or not their principles are actually good enough, whether or not they've actually have arrived, whether or not they actually are a good person, whether or not they actually are generous, whether or not they actually will have a legacy that is worth remembering, whether or not they will have purpose. And it's the extroverted feeling parent's job of the ISFJ to use their parent to continue to guide the introverted feeling inferior in the direction it needs to go, to guide the principles of the introverted feeling inferior, to reassure the introverted feeling inferior of how far it's come, but then also show the FI inferior how far it still has to go, basically, from a principle point of view. That way, the ENTJ is always able to be focused on the goal instead of getting lost in the process. And the same thing that the NI parent provides a path forward, even though the expert intuition inferior is way too afraid to continue, which could lead to stagnation in the relationship, for example. This is ultimately the test of the parent. The test is basically whether or not the inferior functions of both types will listen to each other's parent function, but also the test is whether or not each of these two types will use their parent functions and parent the inferior function of the other person instead of just enabling the inferior function of the other person, which happens when they're cognitive looping. The parent function turns on, stops the hero and the child from cognitive looping, and then it's like, no, stop. I need to take care of the inferior. You're scaring the baby. And then actually sees to the baby and holds the baby accountable and guarantees and makes sure that the baby, the inferior function, is still growing. That's the whole point. As much as it also kind of holds the child from play at times and reminds the child that it's bedtime, and the parent steps in, but it can cost a lot of energy. The thing is that this relationship is so energized within the ego, these two types have no excuse. There is plenty of energy for the parent function to be used. And if they're not using their mental energy on their parent function, well, then they're just being selfish and willing to take down the other person with them. And they'll end up homeless, addicted to drugs together on the street. Great. What a great thing. So let's talk about the actual internal mechanics of the relationship. We've talked about it a lot for the most part, but ultimately cognitive functions the way they are, between they have great emotional compatibility, they have great sexual compatibility. Extroverted sensing a child is all about trying to give and impact the introverted sensing hero, because the extroverted sensing child sees the SI hero as their hero, and it's hey, if I can give the hero a good experience, a good memorable experience, I can do that to anybody. You know what I'm saying? Or when the TI child, it's hey, if I could tell the truth to extroverted thinking hero who is so knowledgeable, but I can get them to realize a fact that they didn't realize before, I have made it, and that's ultimately how these two interact with each other. It's so great. Or when the NI parent makes the NE inferior feel so desired, almost to the point of the NI parent coming off super rapey to the ISFJ, but the ISFJ just loves it. They just love that so much. And then also, when the extroverted feeling parent reminds the FI inferior that they're not a bad person on a regular basis. This is literally how the relationship goes, and it just contributes to the overall happiness of this natural pair. It just comes off natural to them. They end up being these people who can just be themselves. One thing about the natural pair is that each of the 8 sexual compatible relationships, they all have certain needs that they're fulfilling, or certain roles that they take within the macro psyche of humanity itself. The affection relationship is there when someone is lacking joy, right? The companionship relationship is there when someone is super lonely. But the natural pair is there to facilitate healing, the healing of wounds the ego, and they end up healing and support. It is the relationship of support. It is the relationship of the ego, and they end up healing each other. And that's what happens when these cognitive functions are interacting with one another, because you can literally be yourself. It doesn't matter, for example, it doesn't matter how much of an edgelord or how kinky you are in the bedroom. Your natural pair will be happy to do anything and everything you ever wanted in your entire life, everything you dreamed of as a child, especially when it comes to a bedroom experience or even a parenting experience or any experience within life. The natural pair is just by default, you can assume, completely down for it. They're ready. Their body is ready, and you don't have to worry about that at all. They are there, they are ready. And it's going to happen. Period. End of story. Why wouldn't you want to be a part of that? That's what the natural pair is all about. So, and that's ultimately a testament, towards their compatibility as a result. Just another bit thing about this is that parent functions, after passing the test of the parent functions can end up relieving the anxiety of the inferior function. And if you look at the golden pair, it's mostly yeah, life sucks, I'm here for you, that kind of a thing, that kind of face-to-face relationship. But in the natural parent functions go to the crying baby, see that the crying baby, what it needs, gives the baby what it needs, and it relieves all of the anxiety for that child. It just does. That inferior, that infant, basically, the crying baby. And that is amazing, because any anxiety that these types actually have, they just take away all that anxiety. Whereas anxiety is still present within the golden pair. So that's another issue. However, just understand, because of that removal of anxiety, there can be some problems. I've noticed that natural pair, especially sexuality, like they can go all in terms of sexuality, but then all of a sudden they've gotten so close to each other, they have to spend an extreme amount of time apart from each other. And I've seen natural pairs do this on a regular basis. Sometimes they have to like increase the sexual tension in order for them to get back and have a really good bedroom experience, which is kind of natural for them to do because their child and their hero functions aren't exactly lined up with each other at the same level. So they can reintroduce tension, but it can take a little bit longer. Whereas in a golden pair, that tension actually comes back faster. So in some cases, you could argue the golden pair ends up having a better bedroom relationship in the long term. I think that's kind of theoretical to a point. I could see where the argument is coming from, but there's a higher level of closeness in the natural pair than there is within the golden pair over time. And that closeness has a risk of destroying tension in the relationship. Because as it says, absence makes the heart grow fonder. That saying was from the Disney's Robin Hood movie from the 90s that I grew up with. What a great film. But that's super important. Like that's a mega important perspective, because so the natural pair ends up having to learn over time that, hey, maybe we need to have a little bit of absence from each other naturally. Now the golden pair this is how the relationship works. Highest highs, lowest lows. There usually is an air of tension in there. But the natural pair can be so enabling that, the sexual relationship can suffer, because it is the relationship that has the highest capacity out of all of the 8 sexual compatibilities of having the highest level of closeness, right? The absolute highest level of closeness. And because of that super high closeness, there isn't as much sexual tension. So they have to make sure that sexual tension, at least the man of the relationship, needs to make sure that sexual attention is being reintroduced on a regular basis. However, if they're enabling each other's success instead of enabling each other's failure, oftentimes, the man of the relationship ends up doing that just naturally on their own. So it's give and take. It's like, is it half a dozen or is it 6? Oh wait, they're the same thing. You know what I'm saying? So it ends up coming out. But again, you really have to be careful. This is not something I really talked about very much, but the natural pair definitely does have a risk of harming the sexual relationship over time if there's a lack of tension. And that's why I have observed that natural pairs sometimes have to have a break from each other sometimes in order to reintroduce that tension and bring things back, especially sexually, because there is no point in being in a sexual relationship without sex. I mean, men don't get into a relationship with women unless they already want to have sex with that woman. So, there's no point. There's really no point. And if women are out there thinking otherwise, I mean, I got something to tell you. That's just not how it is. I mean, I will never consider spending time with a woman unless I plan on having sex with her. That's just the reality. Unless I want to. Come on. And it's so funny to me, when these women, for example, on Discord, think, they can, really, there was one recently that told me to, go F myself and just get out of my life and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but I never even committed to anything to you. I never said anything to you. What are you talking about? And she treated me like crap. And I'm just like, I've never even met you. I don't even and I'm like, what makes you believe that I actually want to have a sexual relationship with you? Because that's the first requirement for a man to be interested in having a relationship with a woman. So, yeah. You haven't even invested any time or effort in that regard. So, no, it's not going to happen. no thank you. And it's like these women, especially like these online girls, they oftentimes put the cart in front of the horse, and it's just like, what? Okay. Oh yeah, nice emotional connection, but there's no sexual connection there. Like, I mean, until they're willing to make that sexual connection happen, it's like, okay, how can I or any other man out there actually even prioritize that relationship? This is why I entirely agree with Tomasi about long distance relationships. They just don't work, and they should not be something that, people invest in. And oftentimes I don't really spend that much time, because I've had LDRs in the past, and I don't spend much time doing LDRs, and I hate LDRs. The thing is like, if the woman is like really going to prove herself to me in that regard and actually facilitate a sexual relationship for us, then great. I'm open to considering that. But if she's not, then I'm not interested, and I won't be interested. She could just move on, get on my life, because I'm not going to make her a priority in any way, shape, or form, and that's no different, especially from a natural pair point of view. The ENTJ and the ENTJ men, they just have nothing to do with LDRs, but at least it's so interesting to see that ISFJ men are actually more open to it, but that's the difference between Crusader men and Wayfarer men, because Wayfarer men live in the moment. They're not going to put in so much hope, almost like a fool's hope that a Crusader man would necessarily put into a relationship. Whereas the NI of a Wayfarer man is just like, yeah, no, not doing this. There's girls that are closer to me that I could get with. Why am I going to waste my time hoping and potentially getting catfished, waiting for over, as a result, which is definitely a risk, so that ends up continuing a problem. So the reason the natural is so magnetic is that each child idolizes the other hero. The theme is both the childhood hero and the awe that follows. The natural is also magnetic because of the parent's treatment of the other person's inferior. The inferior is cared for and protected by the parent. It relieves the inferior's anxiety. We talked about that. Optimistic functions, SI hero to SE child. The ENTJ's SE child is completely enamored by the strong, reliable, and sensitive SI hero. Sensitive means literally sensitive. Introverted sensing hero reacts to every touch from the SE child and finds the satisfaction in the SE child's relentless performance and ability to create new and exciting shared experiences, especially in the bedroom. True. Extroverted thinking hero to TI child. Purpose, the ISFJ's TI child finds a great conversationalist in the ENTJ, and the ENTJ consistently brings loads of fresh input, and the ISFJ quickly devours them and gives back something better. The ENTJ will be generous in giving more and more input. The ENTJ finds purpose in educating the TI child. They ask questions and offer insight that TI child could never conceive of on their own. The ENTJ shields the ISFJ from bad input. Oh my God, which is such a huge issue because of extroverted thinking. Trickster and ISFJs making decisions based on bad input, like my mother, like my whole life. And then my dad being an ENFJ with his extroverted thinking demon, not being there to shield my mother from bad input, which is literally destroyed the entire health of my family, because my mother is walking around thinking that inorganic and GMO foods are actually good. And it's just like, no. And she's like, oh, well, I didn't know. No one told me. And I'm like, read a book. Please. Realize that something is wrong. Oh my God, please. The ENTJ finds purpose in educating the TI child. They ask questions and offer insight that TI child could never conceive of on their own. The ENTJ shields the ISFJ from bad input. There's rich, vibrant, and effortless conversation between these types, which is true. And then if you look at the pessimistic functions, introvert intuition parent to extrovert intuition inferior, which is purpose. ENTJ's NI parent stabilizes the relationship. Their vision for the future also sources the purpose, basically getting across that minefield like we talked about. Not only relieves the ISFJ of their uncertainty, but infuses extrovert intuition inferior with stable hope. Here, the ISFJ becomes capable of discerning the future with much more confidence and can faithfully get behind the ENTJ's guiding light that will not lead them over a cliff, because the ISFJ will follow the ENTJ over a cliff. And, that's the thing. Extroverted feeling parent to FI inferior, though, from a perspective of satisfaction, extroverted feeling parent relives the anxiety over the ENTJ's own self-worth and anxiety over how to value things. Extroverted feeling parent holds the FI inferior and shows the ENTJ the ways in which it already is worthy. Furthermore, the ISFJ helps the ENTJ develop their own personal philosophy, and the ISFJ finds satisfaction in the parental role of affection, compassion, and teaching. But also just knowing that they're improving the ENTJ and helping the ENTJ become a better person overall. They really draw a lot of personal sense of satisfaction, knowing that they can be that knight in shining armor as an example to the ENTJ, so that the ENTJ can become a better person, and that brings them a ton of satisfaction as a result. So, we talked a little bit earlier about when the natural pair goes wrong, but it's all about enabling when the extroverted feeling parent is just like not there and everything's cognitive looping. That ends up becoming a serious problem. And then it basically normalizes destructive or irresponsible behavior. And they both can end up becoming irresponsible. They can end up being the most responsible of all the relationships, and then they can end up becoming the most irresponsible of all the relationships. That is the risk of the natural pair, which can blow up in their face. So it causes enablement when the hero and child loop never stops, which is caused by an absent parent where a type does not embrace their responsibility. For the ENTJ and ISFJ specifically, this manifests as an endless exchange of sensory pleasures and new experiences, which is SI hero to extrovert sensing child, and endless intellectual exploration and status-seeking behavior, which is extrovert thinking hero to TI child. It's basically an endless loop that leads to stagnation. It's like you're on a rocking horse, a lot of movement, but going nowhere in life, basically. And this can be a huge problem, very huge problem for these two types. That would suck, So without the parent's involvement, which also leads to instability in the inferior, it also increases anxiety in the inferior, which could eventually cause the relationship to break up, not because an individual's inferior function becomes anxious, but because the other person realizes that, hey, their partner has stopped growing. They've stopped growing because that person is anxious, and that other person may not be aware that that person is anxious, and that anxiety is causing them to stop growing, but then they're being judged for not growing. Yet the other person in the relationship is doing nothing to solve the problem of their anxiety. They're literally setting each other up for failure. Wow. Like that sucks. That's pathetic. So do you think the ISFJ will end up being compassionate without extroverted feeling parent? Any inferior will run rampant with envy. And will the ENTJ be able to see how generosity gives them a better future when they're only focused on status and performance? Their greed, basically? No, it's not going to happen. So without the parent, there's no one to challenge the hero because the child is simply starstruck and will not even be able to think about criticizing their hero. The parent, however, is unimpressed with stardom. The only way to save this relationship from spiraling out of control is by maintaining personal responsibility. Again, folks, the success or failure of the relationship is based on whether or not they are willing to take responsibility for the other person's success using their own parent function. This is how it works with every natural pair. It is the same. This is how it works, okay? So as a result, the only way to save the relationship is to bring back the parent when it gets this bad. Bring back the parent. Remember, it's like, so you can always go back to the test of the critic to make sure that, they're still able to succeed with or without you, but you can always go back to the test of the parent every single time to save the relationship if things get bad. But hey, if they don't pass the test of the parent again, probably should, it's likely their relationship's going to break up, so you got to be careful. So bring back the parent. Why is the parent's presence so vital? Each parent serves two essential roles for the ENTJ and ISFJ. The first role is in interrupting and refining the hero-child loops, which we'd already discussed. The second role is by putting the appropriate amount of pressure on the inferior. Sometimes the inferior is like, hey, it's time to grow up. You can't be in Neverland for like your entire life. You have to grow up, right? That's the whole point. So anti-parent, what does it do? Anti-parent must interrupt the introverted sensing loop that threatens the relationship's future. So much of the ESTP-INFP relationship, this SESI loop dominates an obsession with living for the present at the expense of the future. Oh my God. Yeah, this is kind of where like the shadow deadly sin of the ENTJ comes out, gluttony. And then that gluttony ends up enabling over-satisfaction in the ISFJ. Oh, it's horrible and it's gross. Anti-parent interrupts this loop and demands that both the ISFJ and themselves learn to use their performance and discipline to prepare for the future in addition to enjoying the present. It's like, hey, we kind of have to sacrifice the now to have a better tomorrow because we're going to get old tomorrow. That's a problem. Anti-parent must also put enough pressure on the ISFJ to not always assume the other person's intentions and have nothing but fear for the future. Because that's the thing, like sometimes ISFJs just assume danger. And anti-parent's like, you can't do that. You can actually take risk And the thing is that like the NI parent just absolutely loathes any inferior being entirely risk averse and will force the any inferior to actually be willing to take risks, which helps the ISFJ actually like deal with the test of the demon, which is like, hey, for their own selves, their own ego. It's like, hey, they have to learn the lesson of the demon, which is, hey, be willing to take risks. It's just really hard for ISFJs to take risks on their own. And the ENTJ is there to help facilitate that phenomenon so they don't feel like they're taking risks on their own, So that's a big important thing. Let's look at extrovert feeling parent. Extrovert feeling parent must interrupt the TETI loop, ensuring that the mere conversation or the sole pursuit of achievement does not sacrifice the ENTJ's or the ISFJ's humanity or compassion. Extroverted feeling parent becomes the testing ground for the intellectual exchange between TE hero and TI child. Extroverted feeling parent's presence not only makes the ISFJ more compassionate, but it also puts enough pressure on the ENTJ to use their FI inferior. And it basically forces the ENTJ to be a good person. The thing is that sometimes, I've noticed ISFJs often turn a blind eye to the ENTJ's poor behavior. And that sucks too. Turning that blind eye. And it's just entirely ridiculous, So extroverted feeling, and as the ENTJ uses their inferior under the care of the ISFJ, it actually brings out more generosity from the ENTJ. It helps them be a better person. And not only that, like, it helps them become remembered. It helps the ENTJ actually realize their legacy. And that's the most important part. Out of all of the sexual compatibilities, the natural pair is the one that facilitates the other person getting their cognitive origin the most. Why? Because they're not looking to get the same origins. They have similar origins. They're complementary. And they're like, hey, I'll be the king of these castles over here. You be the queen of those castles over there. And we're good. We just have an amazing alliance, and we don't have to worry about it. Imagine if King Aegon II and Queen Rhaenyra were actually able to have two separate kingdoms simultaneously and just work with one another. Imagine what would happen then. Of course, maybe, Aegon the Conqueror's prophecy of the prince that was promised would probably not work in that case, but, and they wouldn't be able to, like, defeat the Night King during the Long Night, but whatever, we could figure out our weird Targaryen bloodline later, so, like, who cares, so, anyway. The burden of these types expressing their living virtue and using their deadly sin as well is a responsibility of at least partially borne by the other person's parent function, or born as in like bared by, like it's their responsibility, right? The parent will likely never experience a deeper sense of meaning than within the natural pair. Why? Because in the natural pair, each parent function is the compatible variant of the other's inferior. The parent literally gets to raise the infant, and in doing so, it eliminates all of the anxiety while simultaneously promoting absolute aspiration in the other person. The natural pair is the relationship that literally generates what people call the power couple, right? It's just colloquially, that definition may not apply, but it really is. I maintain that the natural pair is the relationship that gets people to the highest heights in life. I think people are able to reach integration and a much higher level of holiness, aka completeness, as a result of the natural pair than any of the other 8 sexually compatible relationships. Hands down. And that is especially true for the ENTJ and the ISFJ. Especially true, right? And a lot of people just don't even see that, So yeah, that's really what it comes down to. Like, if you're not willing to take responsibility for, your lover's growth, especially the natural pair, it's not necessarily that they are the problem, like, you are the problem. That just means you're unloving. That just means you're disrespectful. That means you're not really worthy of that person. And that's a big deal. You have to understand what your responsibility is. And it's so funny to me to see, like, women in society just not being attracted to men who already understand that and have that trait, aka Crusader men, because we all have that understanding by default. We have that natural understanding, but then they just want to judge us as, like, someone who's like, they don't even notice us. They don't even notice. Like, we are not noticed. Like, Crusader men are just not noticed by women at all. And it's because society has enabled them to provide the beta male side of their hypergamy for themselves, so that the only men women are attracted to are the men who don't even want relationships. And that's the saddest part of the world. That's why by 2030, as the statistic goes, 50% of childbearing age women will be childless and alone. Wow, what a future we have. It's absolutely going to destroy our future. We really aren't really going to have a future as a society or a race if we don't get that fixed. So that's why we need these power couples, these natural pairs. The only other thing I could say about the natural pair is just watch out for the closeness. You guys have the highest opportunity to get as close as possible and closer than any of the other sexual compatibilities. The problem is that closeness can destroy your sexuality, which is the entire point of the relationship to begin with. So you have to make sure that as you come together, you also are not together and increase that sexual tension from time to time. Okay? Super important. That would be like me telling Rich she can't go to the club with her friends. You know, a lot of people out there, especially like on Instagram or memes, talk about how, if a woman wants to go clubbing, she ain't a good woman. And it's like, well, increases sexual tension. Why not have sexual tension? Like, come on. But if you're expecting there to be closeness all the time, there's not going to be a relationship for very much longer. And a lot of people just don't understand that. It's just so funny to me to watch, like, especially like NFJs claim that, we have to be close all the time because they're so needy, without even realizing that is so suffocating that it ends up destroying relationships in the process. It's just so entirely ridiculous to me. So anyway, folks, that's it for season 14, part 3, episode 3, the ENTJ and the ISFJ natural pair, bronze pair. Thank you all for watching, and please leave some comments here in the membership area. That'd be great. And hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.